Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I am Paul Elam at paulelam.com. And today I'm joined by This is Shah, who we've spoken with before, also by Dr. Stephen Baskerville. And today we're going to be talking about federal family policy and whether that's an oxymoron or mutually exclusive terms. And with that, I'm just going to hand off the floor to the experts. Shah?
All right. Well, thanks for having us, Paul. And just to kind of give your audience a brief overview here, we're going to be discussing pretty much the federal government's involvement in your personal, family life and the impact that it has and why it's important to know about, as well as Dr. Baskerville and I's bid to try to get in there and influence some of this stuff. So we'll be focusing on ACF, the Administration for Children and Families, which Dr. Baskerville has his eye on that position. This is all housed within HHS, which we know RFK Jr. is currently the head of. And I'll be focusing on OCSS, which is the Office of Child Support Services. And that is the federal, top of the pyramid for the entire federal child support program, which goes all the way down through the state and county levels. So we're going to be talking about that from a general level and then trying to dig into that a little bit and make the case for why it's important to pay attention to this and how it impacts individual American families. So, yeah, without further ado, I just want to introduce Dr. Baskerville, Stephen Baskerville, who's written a few books. You can find them on Amazon, Taken into Custody and Who Lost America. And I think, Dr. Baskerville, if you want to just say a few words, introduce yourself, and maybe we can just jump right into the federal government's impact on families. That'd be great.
Okay. Well, thank you, Shah, and thank you, Paul, for having us here. Yeah, my field is political science by training, and I never planned to get myself involved in the politics of government family policy, but I had my plans and God had his. So now I'm in the thick of it for the last 25 years or so. This is what I've been writing and publishing on. And it's quite a surprise for me. Even to this day, I discover new things every day that I hadn't known about after publishing 3 or 4 books on the subject. So that your audience will, let's start at the most basic level. I mean, if your audience is wondering, where is it in the Constitution that authorizes the federal government? I don't know of any passage in the U.S. Constitution that says, Congress shall have the power to micromanage the families of America and tell you when you're allowed to be with your children and when you're allowed to be in your own home. But that, in fact, is what's happened. So the question is, how did we get here briefly? Why is the federal government involved in family policy, and what is that policy? Is it benign? Does it do good for children and families, or is it pernicious? And my argument is, in a nutshell, it's about 90% pernicious, but there's also some ways in which the federal government could exercise some benign role in family policy, mostly negative, but nevertheless benign. Well, the federal government's involvement in families goes at least back to the New Deal. One of the bureaus, as you said, the Administration for Children and Families is the umbrella group that deals with things like child abuse accusations and child support enforcement, and a little bit on things like domestic violence. So it has a big impact on families, on fathers, on children, and on the private lives of everyone. Underneath the ACF is departments like the Children's Bureau, which goes back to the New Deal. It's one of the older welfare agencies, and it's started out as a welfare agency to help or to assist families. Sometimes nowadays, whether they want that assistance or not. And some people think that the Children's Bureau in its early days did have benign purposes to help out families where the men had been removed because of the Great Depression, unemployment, or because of war. Maybe it did. But it's gone from, like many federal agencies, it's gone from solving a problem to creating the problem that it's supposed to be solving. So it doesn't just help families where the men have been removed. uh, through other forces, but it sometimes helps. In fact, it often removes the fathers and the men themselves, and sometimes the mothers. So there's the ACF is the umbrella group. The Children's Bureau is one. The Office of Child Support Services, it's now called, is the federal government that directs or oversees child support collections. By the way, most of the bulk of all of this is state governments. State governments are supposed to do this. They supply most of the manpower, although the federal government is becoming larger just in terms of personnel. And all of these are backed by federal statutes. For example, the Mondale Act, child abuse accusations are handled by the Children's Bureau, are backed by the Mondale Act from the 1970s, which gives federal money to state governments to investigate child abuse accusations. And some would say, too, gives them a financial incentive to manufacture child abuse accusations. And beneath them is the Office of Child Support Services, as I said, supposedly supports states in the collection of child support, but in fact, it also, in many ways, drives them and propels them to collect more child support than they're really authorized to collect. And then the ACF also has an uncertain role in domestic violence accusations, which federally are covered by the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. Most of this, I think, is administered by the Justice Department, but to some unclear extent, it is also handled to some extent by the ACF, which is part of HHS. So all these are the three main functions I think that your audience should know about of child abuse accusations, domestic violence accusations, and child support collections. As I say, all of these agencies are administered, obviously, by federal functionaries, and many of them have been administered for decades by bureaus, by social workers, essentially. And the social work profession over the decades has become more and more bureaucratic and more ideologically driven with ideologies like feminism. And these two this bureaucratic self-interest, the material self-interest of many of these functionaries, and the ideological drive of many of these social workers reinforce one another, so that in many ways, they do, as some people cynically suggest. Many federal agencies often, the name of a federal agency often indicates what it destroys. And in this case, the Administration for Children and Families has no small role in removing fathers, sometimes removing mothers, removing parents generally, and sometimes removing children, and sometimes dismembering families. So there's your overview of it. We can go into the particulars. Shah and I are going for these positions. I've thrown in my hat into the ring for the Assistant Secretary for Children and Families, administering all of ACF. And Shah, I've convinced Shah to put in his hat for the Director of the Office of Child Support Services. And he has, if he doesn't tell you about it, I'll tell you now, he has years of concrete expertise and hands-on experience working in the field of child support enforcement. I have written books on ACF. I have written books and scholarly articles on this, so that is my primary level of expertise. But I'll turn it back over to you, Sean, and let me know what you think where we should begin.
Just before we get into too much of the particulars, I just wanted to use child support as an example of how the federal government has slowly encroached into the American family, and even past into what the states were supposed to handle on their own, how the federal government got its tentacles involved. And when it comes to child support, the story of that really goes back to the creation of the welfare program. And if you want to go beyond that, there was always these kind of two parallel lines of family law that existed, even going all the way back towards like English common law and Elizabethan poor laws and all that kind of stuff. But pretty much, there was a private family law and a public family law. And for most normal families, they had this kind of right to kind of privacy, and private family law would sort of help them out with their issues. And then there was public family law, which is when you had folks that were, for lack of a better term, burdens on the state, and they required state help because of whatever it was, out of wedlock births and things like that, which were really low a long time ago. But then once the state and the, taxpayer had to get involved to help keep these folks, above water, that's when the state says, okay, we're now going to be involved in your life. And what we're going to do is require you to do X, Y, and Z, and the state now has the right to intrude in it. So that would be a public family law, which is kind of grounded in this sort of welfare idea, so to speak. Coming into more recent history, especially, after World War II, when you had a lot of men who'd passed away in the war and a lot of widows from that, welfare was really created to help them. And as time went on and the culture changed, a lot more folks, what they found in the mid 70s is that a lot of the folks that were on welfare weren't these widows, who had lost their husbands in the war. It was really just people who were out here having kids, and whoever the fathers were still alive. And then they were just on the welfare rolls, receiving money and not creating families. So what Congress did to try to combat this issue is they created the federal child support program. And prior to this, child support used to be handled by the states in whatever way they saw fit to do. But because federal taxpayer money was going out through the Social Security, program, Title 4A here, they were trying to figure out, how do we get this money paid back and more efficiently? So they created a federal child support program, and they pretty much told the states, look, listen, if you want to receive welfare grants from the federal government, you need to do child support in the way we tell you to do it, basically. And so that created in 1975 the federal child support program, which then created the Office of Child Support Enforcement, which is now called the Office of Child Support Services, because enforcement wasn't just a politically correct term, apparently, so they had to change it. Which is a way of them masking some of the stuff that they do, but that's another. Anyways, so when it was first created, it was only meant to work welfare cases. So it was still firmly seated in this public family law sort of side of the dichotomy, as opposed to the private family law, right? We still had, just that separation was more defined. But as time went on, what the federal government started doing was encouraging states to start taking on non-welfare cases, advertising their services to people who had never been on welfare, and say, hey, we'll do this stuff for you at the taxpayer's expense. We'll get you a child support order. We'll enforce the child support order for you, and you don't have to go through private court anymore. And we'll do it all at the taxpayer's dime. So what this represented was this kind of incursion of public family law and sort of big brother government into the private sort of sphere here. And they sort of left what they were originally responsible for, which was just getting this welfare money back. And they're like, hey, let's go take money from non-welfare families and get involved in their lives, which created these kind of perverse incentives for people to just break up their family or have kids out of wedlock more, and all these kinds of things. So this has been a sort of crawl. Well, it started off as a crawl, then it really got legs, in the mid 80s, and then especially in the mid 90s when the Welfare Reform Act was passed through Congress, and that made the federal child support program into this kind of monster and abomination that we have today. And as Dr. Baskerville mentioned earlier, the names of these programs tend to kind of tell you what it is that they're destroying. And in this case, child support tends to really harm, in where children could be growing up more in intact families. And we all know at this point that that's better for them to have their fathers in their lives. Child support has kind of served as this wedge and this barrier from that happening. And this is something I think most people don't really know the story about, at least not the history. So they don't really know what we've lost. They take it as a given. I worked in child support as an agent for years, and I've sort of seen this firsthand. It was my job to kind of do this to folks. So just to finish up on the generality part here, I just wanted to give people that overview of how we got here. And my sort of biggest pet peeve with all this is I do not like that this sort of ballooned, bloated public family law system still intrudes its way into the private family sphere. And you see this because it's not just welfare families, right? Normal middle class families are subject to the harsh enforcement measures of the federal child support program in your county. Every county has an agency. You see people higher up the ladder. You see celebrities that just can't deal with it. You have athletes. You have people who are successful and contribute a lot to society being disincentivized from creating families because we have this abomination of a program that has really overstepped its boundaries over the years.
I'd like to make note of something along with that too. I had a quiet chuckle to myself when you said that they wanted to improve efficiency, so they created a federal program. I thought that was pretty funny. That's usually how things turns out. But I find it interesting. The human species went 200,000 years, able to pair bond, procreate, breed families. We ended up dominating the globe. We started ritualizing marriage about 4,000 years ago, according to historical records. And we started codifying it much later. I think the first marriage license was issued in Massachusetts in 1639. And this is where we start bringing the state into it at that point. And we fast forward to 2025, and the divorce rate is nearly 50%. Broken families everywhere. Single mothers costing taxpayers $421 billion annually in the U.S. alone. I think we can make a strong argument here that government involvement in the family and even the ritualized involvement of the church in the family has ended up in a really bad place for the family. And so while we analyze and pick at these government agencies, which are doing, I agree, terrible things, I think the big view, the 30,000-foot view is keep other people out of your family. Keep controlling agencies out of your family. And the question for me is, of course, how to do it. But I just wanted to toss that into the mix here.
Yeah, it's funny, when you describe
No,
it like
Paul,
that. Sorry, Dr. Baskerville, go ahead. I'll go after you.
oh, okay, I was just going to say the long-term perspective that you raised, Paul, I think is helpful there. I mean, I think what happened over the centuries is that the state, as part of the consolidation of the state's power, roughly in the 16th century, the states of Europe became more and more powerful and excluded others. They came up with the divine right of kings, and then later on, similar doctrines to exclude, the various estates of the realm and to monopolize their power. And one of the powers they excluded, I think, was to a large extent the church. And the state basically took over the control of the marriage agreement from the church. And over the centuries, some people argue the Protestant Reformation had a decisive role in that, but I think the Catholic Church also acquiesced in that. And the church basically abdicated its largely non-coercive authority to the state authorities. And as the state consolidated its authority over the church over the centuries, it reached the point by the 20th century where it controlled the marriage contract, and then it stopped enforcing it. So the no-fault divorce was really an action of world historical importance if you look at it in that perspective, because the state said, okay, now we've got monopoly control over the marriage agreement, but we're not going to enforce it anymore. So effectively, they abolished marriage, as Maggie Gallagher said, the abolition of marriage, and with it the abolition of the family. So the state, and it was there that the state, once they did, and in many ways, no-fault divorce simply codified what was already taking place, what was already being practiced by these bureaucratic agencies and by the courts. So that's when the entree was, for the state to come in and take control of families. And I will just mention two things that I basically allowed the state to come in to the private family. One is the one that Shah mentioned, the long-term perspective, and that is it began with the poor. It began with low-income communities and the welfare state, all of these agencies, child abuse, child domestic violence and child support enforcement all began with the welfare agencies. And the poor are much more vulnerable to intrusion into their lives. They don't have the time, the leisure, the education often to defend their privacy and their homes and their rights the way middle class people do. So this entered through the avenue of wealth, the vehicle of welfare and poor relief, and spread from there to the middle class. And so in some ways it did begin with the new, it was in some ways the way we reacted to the new, which was new development of industrial development and the creation of an urban proletariat, which in the United States we created by way of this so-called safety net. But we made a hash of it, and we created this underclass instead. The other thing I would mention about to answer your question, how does the state gain this entry into the family? Well, the main way, the most common way of all, is some accusation. Usually, and the weakest point in the family chain, the family link, the family bonds, is the father. The father is always the weakest link. It's the most easily broken. So an accusation of child abuse or domestic violence against the father is usually the easiest way to break the family up, and that rationalizes the entry of the state into the private realm. Any father who's been summoned to family court on a divorce petition knows that the first thing the judge does is remove him from the household. They say it's temporary. They say, this is just a temporary measure, but it's never temporary. It lasts for the rest of your children's childhood. So that's always the first step. The first principle of family court, of welfare agencies, remove the father. So sorry, I'll just leave it at that. And Shah, thank
Yeah,
you.
well, just to touch on a little bit of Paul's question there, it's in what Dr. Baskerville is saying about this kind of encroaching of the state and these so-called safety nets and the expansion and ballooning of the welfare program. A lot of that is what unfortunately undid marriage, especially things like no-fault divorce. Prior to that, you had a lot more family planning that went into marriage and how families did marriage. Paul and I had a great discussion on the dowry system and how that, worked in the West more particularly. But once you get into the welfare state, no-fault divorce, it really contends with the need of this traditional family planning style, which had been the norm for hundreds, thousands of years, frankly. And it disincentivizes people from doing that because there's this constant big brother state who's ready to push you out of your own house. It's funny when I always think of this metaphor of being in a house with my family, but there just is this sort of big bully sitting on the couch there at all times in your house for some reason. And it's like, how did we get there? But that really is just the state, in your house at all times. You may not see that literally, but that really is based off of the laws that we have. Our own marriage contracts don't work. It's entirely dependent on the family code. That's really how they've made it to be. And when it comes to the sort of federal government's role in this, the states had their own, individual family codes that sort of worked for them as best as they had it. But states are basically, you can say, more or less carrot and sticked or paid or incentivized by the government to create more uniformity in their laws that work with the overall goals and, whatever it is that the federal government wants. So they'll say, hey, if you want more welfare dollars or you want to continue this, you guys should adopt these laws or make your family law codes to kind of match, what we want you to do. So what that does is it leads to less diversity in thinking of how family laws should be within states. And it creates a problem from a higher level. One of the things I always hear is just like, well, what does the presidency have to do with family law? It's a states issue. It's a states issue. And it's true, states have the ultimate authority there. But unfortunately, the federal government gives them too much incentive to not change things, because if they do, something like the Office of Child Support Services or ACF's going to look at it and say, hey, we're going to, take away what you're getting here if you don't comply with what we're saying. So, yeah, just to touch on that a little bit.
And if I could toss in one
Like,
additional question for the both of you with this, you both touched on the idea of no fault divorce in one way or another in your responses to this. And, that's something I see online and in other activists quite a bit saying we need to get rid of no fault divorce. Um, but as Dr. Baskerville pointed out, that was pretty much going on before we had no fault divorce. You would just generate fault.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh,
Perjury, essentially.
uh, uh, exactly. And that goes on in family courts across the board to this day. Lawyers and witnesses are lying regularly. The court knows they're lying and they look the other way or enable the lying in many ways. So, if we got rid of no fault divorce, wouldn't we just create a new fault industry? Wouldn't lawyers just glom onto this and say, okay, no, I need an extra private investigator to dig up or create dirt, whether it's there or not, and then we can drag this contentious battle out even further and everybody makes more money?
Um, I agree with you on that, frankly. From what I've read, especially with the history of no fault prior to it being passed and being adopted by a lot of the states, what you saw was a lot of even sort of colluding between the husband and wife sometimes, because back then, if both parties wanted to get divorced, they still wouldn't be able to get a dissolution or an actual divorce, because they would say, why are we going to divorce you? There's no one's committed any fault. And that was the system that kept families together. So what they would do is they would hire maybe, a private investigator or that sort of photographer and say, oh my God, here's the husband and he was with the secretary or some woman of the night in a hotel, and here's the evidence court. And both mom and dad would be in cahoots in order to get their marriage to break. And sometimes they would do state shopping, or they'd have these false domestic abuse allegations if one side really wanted it, but the other didn't. So there'd be all kinds of collusion and perjury going on. And it wasn't even just between the two people. Lawyers were involved. Judges were complicit in this. It had gotten to the point where eventually they said, well, the culture has clearly changed. We may as well update the laws, so to speak, to create no fault. But at the same time with that, unfortunately, they created no fault, but they still kept, expectations on men to be, this provider, traditional figure, which ends up getting guys to just shoot themselves in the foot every single time.
Or the
So,
head?
but yeah, that being said, I agree with you. If you went back to the old at-fault system, it would immediately create this issue of the sort of false allegation industry, I guess you can call it. It would probably still be a little bit of a stumbling block. I mean, it would still put a little bit of a barrier. It would cost maybe, I don't know if it would cost more or less money in order to get this through. I will be honest, I still kind of lean a little bit towards at fault because it at least feels more fair. But you're completely correct when you say that it's a system that has its flaws and that it would no doubt crop up again, maybe even worse than before.
I'm going to add something here, though. I'm going to push back a little on this. This is a story about how people were, fabricating these quarrels and so forth. This is part of the mythology that we hear from the legal profession. I'm not sure how true it really is. Today, about 80% of divorces are unilateral, without the consent of one party. And some people estimate that when children are involved, it's close to 100%. So what we really created here was not just was unilateral divorce and involuntary divorce, forcing people to divorce against their will. And this is one area where I think the federal government actually could do some positive good, because there is a clause in the Constitution which says no state, and it says state, no state shall create any law that impairs the obligation of contracts. The contract clause is a federal, federal constitutional requirement, and states are, basically allowing contracts to be torn up with impunity, and they are tearing them up themselves. And the states are also violating virtually every other principle of the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution. In fact, in my book, Taken into Custody, I go down the Bill of Rights and the rest of the Constitution and show how the federal government how the family courts violate virtually every article of the Bill of Rights and many articles of the main Constitution. So, if the federal government can force, and I think the leverage, the money in the Mondale Act and the child support system and the VAWA, this money could be used not to as leverage to break up families. It could be used as leverage to force states to adhere and respect the Constitution. If you want this federal money for this, you make sure that your child support system and domestic violence laws are um, are consistent with the Constitution. So when we talk about repealing no-fault divorce, it doesn't just mean bringing back all these faults and these battles. It means making the divorce making marriage a legally enforceable contract. That's all. Just like any other contract, it must be legally enforced. The party that breaks it must bear responsibility. It doesn't mean you can't be divorced. You can. You can break the contract, but you accept the responsibility for the consequences for breaking the contract, like in any other contract that you do. Now, some are going to say, oh, but it's much more important than that. It's a holy covenant. Yes, it is a holy covenant on some views, but it's at a minimum, it should be a legally enforceable contract. And Paul, you're probably right that things like, phony domestic violence accusations probably would increase if the only way to get a divorce or separation was by accusing your spouse falsely of a crime like domestic violence, then those accusations probably would increase. But I think we have to bite that bullet. I don't think we should be allowing courts and just throwing up our hands and saying there's nothing we can do about it when courts knowingly look the other way at knowingly false accusations of criminality. Accusing another person of a crime is itself a crime. And most people assume, rightly, I mean, we all assume if we find out otherwise, the courts should and can and do punish people for making false accusations. And mostly they do, as long as they're not domestic violence accusations or child abuse. So I think we have to, if courts are perpetrating chicanery like this and knowingly punishing innocent people for crimes that they did, probably abolished, frankly.
Yeah, I tend to I think there is a role that, actively trying to move or change some of these legal things or abolish certain things is something that we need to be working on collectively as men. But there is also this point of sort of the culture needing to catch up with it in match also. And when I think about our roles at ACF or OCSS, and what it is that I would like to change or see changed there, I think a lot of it does have to do ultimately with what the presidential administration is okay with seeing, because certain changes could be a form of destroying a political career or something. And when I look at somebody like Trump, Trump has his finger on the sort of pulse of the American people and kind of understands what they want, at least enough to appeal popularly enough to be elected in the first place. So there is some level of the culture needing to want this in order to enable this kind of top-down change, so to speak. But when I think about maybe myself and OCSS and what can be done, at least now or where the culture's at, is at least some policy of diminishment. One thing I'd really like to see is these incentive payments stopped or curtailed to the states, and sort of pushing back on the federal government to say, hey, you should only be working these welfare child support cases, and your money and all of your power should only be focused on recouping welfare dollars and not going into non-welfare families and bothering them, so to speak. Technically, the federal government, the child support agencies have the power to be able to charge an amount to non-welfare families who want to use their services. And that's another change that could come down and say, hey, listen, if you want to use the child support agency, you may as well pay us as much as you'd have to pay the private family law court across the street anyways, just to kind of disincentivize this stuff and to, just move it away from bothering non-welfare families. That's the one thing that I really want to see. And I think that's something that can be done currently in the culture that we're at. maybe not an outright abolishment of certain things or deconstruction of it, but I think there's a case to be made to RFK Jr., who's the HHS secretary currently, and even Donald Trump and his team to support that from their end.
Isn't it a little bit telling, though, that I'm totally open about it. I'm a Trump fan and I like RFK as well, but he hasn't mentioned a word about any of this, and all of this is sort of promoting his role at HHS. It's all been about physical health. And not that I'm discounting that. I think it's wonderful that the government is finally starting to do things like revise the food pyramid and look at autism and childhood diabetes and taking measures for that. But that's just part of HHS role in the world. And there's not been a hint of anything where it regards our families and what's happening.
That's a very good point, Paul. And I wrote a series of articles about this, pointing this conspicuous absence out, because you're right. It's a glaring area of neglect by all presidents. But it's especially conspicuous for Trump because otherwise, he's going over the federal government with a fine-tooth comb, and quite rightly so, and weeding out the waste, fraud, and abuse. And yet this is a huge area of waste, fraud, and abuse. And he has ignored it. I will also add he ignored it through his first term. I wrote an article back then saying that he was ignoring this and it would cost him. I think it did cost him. I think much of his opposition, the voting constituency, which opposed Trump and undid him in 2020, was based on children who had come out of the welfare system and out of single-parent homes, and were profoundly alienated from their families, their fathers, and the United States and Western civilization. Angry young people that we have today, and I think those angry young people are growing. So I think it is a conspicuous failure on his part, and I hope that RFK Jr. will notice this. I might point out that Elon Musk, I'm sure, has to know about these abuses. He's been through his own ordeal with the family law system, like a number of prominent men that I have known over the years. So far, he has not used his own case, his own experience, to publicize the larger problems and larger injustices against other men and women and children. And I think this is also a glaring neglect, because Musk has to know about this. And I think he's a very bold man, and I think in many ways he's a very courageous man. But I've seen a lot of courageous men over the years, men who are courageous in many areas of life, physical courage, for example, and yet when they're dealing with the family law machinery, they become, simpering sissies, to be blunt about it. Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, you're right to point that out, and it's something that I thought of too. And I guess the more sort of naive or charitable side of me wants to say, oh, well, maybe they're just not aware of it, or they don't understand it to this deep of a degree, and they don't understand what influence it has. But the other part of me really agrees, especially when Dr. Baskerville brings up like Elon Musk, for example. It's such a elephant in the room. I don't see how they have to be aware of this somewhat. I think their issue is they don't know exactly how to sell this to their constituents without either losing, a lot of votes, especially when it comes to the women's voting bloc. That's going to be a huge issue for them, and support from that side. So it kind of seems like it does sort of seem like something they're afraid to touch a bit. And I think it really does need to be pitched and sold to them as something that they can then sell over to the people, or at least explain, hey, why this is going to be good. I mean, if we cut out those incentive payments and we diminish things, especially with OCSS, that's something that would kind of be in line with Dodge and the Office of Government Efficiency and what they're trying to do. I think part of their overall ethos is trying to save money for the taxpayers where they can. That's one way to do it. One of the sort of I guess, looming issues is that there are, people that are so dependent on welfare and these kinds of things that there's always been, I guess you could say, this kind of threat, like where if you cut welfare, you cut these programs, you're going to see an increase in, orphans or women on the street or something like that, which the state doesn't really seem like they want to it's want to deal with, because on the one hand, if that is a looming threat, then I think people are more incentivized to actually take family planning serious, and make sure they make better decisions. On the other end, if we're going to kind of get out of where we are now and we take a measure that starts to reduce welfare, starts to reduce the federal child support's involvement, you're going to have this kind of painful period of people having to readjust and relearn how to basically do family creation correctly, so as to, prevent the streets being filled with orphans, so to speak, or something like that. And that's kind of the threat that the federal government has on states, basically. They say, if you don't do child support the way we tell you to, we're going to dock the TANF grant, which is the welfare grant. And that's basically telling states, well, we're not going to give you money to house these people and keep them out of the way. You're going to have this issue of having to somehow pay for, the orphans there, or single moms and all this kind of stuff, which they might not be able to do. So on the other end of that, they're trying to think about, how do we not commit, some sort of political destruction of our campaign in that way. So it needs to be done, I think. It needs to be diminished, not very fast, but slowly, and in a way that makes sense,
I think this speaks to something, a very powerful matter of fact in dealing with these issues, that it is almost impossible to imagine a way to circumvent, because as Dr. Baskerville pointed out, you've got does going through the federal government with a fine-tooth comb. And I mean, these people are taking on very solid moneyed interests, powerful people doing this stuff and defying all that power in order to do it. But the moment they come across any kind of fraud and waste that is perceived to benefit women, even those people are like, well, let's go look at something else, because they know that the moment, women vote in their own interest. Men tend to vote in social interests. Women tend to vote in their own interest. And these people are smart enough. I mean, I don't think they've missed this. I think you're both correct. They see it, and they weigh the political cost of doing anything about it and move on to something else. This is why I'm one of these people, and I know I get disagreement about this, that I insist that you must have cultural change in advance of matters like this, because it simply runs into a brick wall every time.
Well, what I think on that is that, I mean, you're right. I agree with you 100% on that. But I think that one thing we need to remind people is that kicking the can down the road, these problems don't just simmer on the back burner. They tend to increase, and they tend to get worse over the decades. And so, if you don't deal with it now, you're going to deal with a bigger problem later on. And if I could just expand on one point that Shah made a couple times about this began with the welfare system, with the low-income communities, who are a minority, a small number relatively of Americans. It then expanded all these programs with no-fault divorce, and with divorce generally. It expanded to the middle class, where it mushroomed. It just grew hugely. But also, even more than that, I'm sure a lot of viewers probably think these are marginal issues that only affect a few, welfare fathers or divorced dads or things like that. But if you consider that one of the programs, especially the way the false accusation industry has mushroomed, has grown over the years. It started in the welfare system. The accusations of domestic violence and child abuse before that, those started in welfare communities. They then moved into the divorce courts, where these accusations were a very effective way for mothers especially to get custody of children and to win in divorce cases. But then they were so successful at this accusation industry, sexual accusation industry, was so successful and encountered so little opposition that they started using it against major political figures. This was the birth of Me Too and the similar operations of Me Too, because they could use it against low-income Black fathers, mostly minority fathers, And that worked without any problem. And then they started using it against middle class fathers in divorce cases, and that worked like a silver bullet. And so, well, why not use it against Donald Trump? Why not use it against the Prince of York, Bill Cosby, um, Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice, when he was being nominated? So and if you wonder where these sexual accusations come from, which are used, these lawfare operations, basically, that are used to derail election campaigns and drive unwanted men out of office and derail court nominations and things like that. This started with the welfare system. It moved on to from low income men to middle class men through the divorce and no fault divorce system and the divorce machinery. And from there, it began to be used for high profile political figures like Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Bill Cosby and the Prince of Wales and Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court nominee, and so forth. So if you're wondering where all these false accusations came from, and there's all these lawfare operations, and then why they're used so successfully to derail election campaigns and court nominations and to drive unwanted men out of office. Well, they started in family courts where they were used to drive unwanted men out of the family. And before that, they were used in the welfare system to drive unwanted men out of their families. So these things don't go away. Kicking the can down the road is only going to make it worse. And, I say to men out there, especially men, but others as well, you may not be interested in the family law and family policy, but I guarantee you family law and family policy are interested in you.
Yeah, one thing that just to kind of touch a little bit on Paul's point about the Trump administration not really mentioning this, it's something I've noticed too, and it's interesting because Elon Musk is kind of always harping on about the birth rates and fertility rates and all that kind of stuff. And even I think from what I've heard from even when they were campaigning, they mentioned IVF. I think Trump mentioned that and some kind of program to do that, but there was no mention about fixing any of these kinds of issues, which kind of brings us squarely into this sort of cultural versus legal change point, which I think ultimately needs to work together. But I understand what you're saying, Paul, about where you kind of have seen this hit a brick wall many times. That's where I tend to look at things like the marriage strike or men who go MGTOW as kind of the one thing that at least gets their attention to start thinking about what's going on, because it's no matter how hard men work or what they do to try to fix this, they tend to get ignored even as they get more and more abused and taken advantage of by the courts. But when men say, okay, I'm going to wash my hands of this, and then a lot of men start doing that, they start avoiding signing the marriage contract, or they start avoiding even wanting to have children because they don't want to deal with this child support issues coming down the line. Which we've seen, and not just in folks that are here on the income ladder, folks that are way up here. Elon Musk himself going through a very public situation currently. It seems like when men start to do that, then folks in power start to take note and say, okay, what's going on? Now, they still seem to drop the ball a lot of the times and figure out how do we make this about women?
I was going to say they hit the same brick wall. They hear these men are walking away, and then they say, okay, let's investigate, let's look into this. And the guys are saying, well, family law is corrupt. It's a terrible deal. I'm not going to get into that. So rather than report that, they go, oh, okay, you hate women. There's our storyline. And we're going with that because we certainly cannot talk about the real reasons that men are walking away. It's the same brick wall you get out of RFK when it comes to the corruption. It's a really, really difficult issue, I think.
Yeah. I see that too.
It is.
When I look at this, I just think it's like, well, I'm trying to find like where is the thread that I can pull to try to at least set this. I don't know if we can go back. I'm more of a proponent of trying to look forward and create something new that maybe incentivizes men and women to work together here and get things working. But I try to look at that and think, what can we do and how can we push back against this system that's essentially encroaching and into our lives. I'd like to think that the Trump administration and RFK Jr. would at least be a little bit more open to that than the other side, though. As we know, with tradcons and things like that, that sometimes they're worse. But yeah, I think maybe talking a little bit about Dr. Baskerville, if you were made, I think director or secretary of ACF, what changes or what you would change about the program, or maybe get into some particulars about what you would do and how this would impact or benefit men, in the nation. And then I can maybe talk a little bit about OCSS for my part there.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Well, the Undersecretary, Assistant Secretary for ACF does have a fair amount of authority in these areas, and there's several things I would do in that post. One of them, I suppose, the broadest thing I would do, uh, I start out by ensuring that all agencies under ACF be forced to respect and adhere to the United States Constitution. I mean, that to me is a no-brainer. Every federal official must swear to uphold and defend the Constitution. And I think, if anybody is presiding over government policies that have the effect, not even just the intention, but the effect of violating the Constitution, then there's no excuse for that. They simply have to be modified or curtailed. So that would be the first thing I would do. Now, one example of that, I think a pretty obvious example, is what I spoke about earlier about false accusations of crimes, false accusations of child abuse, false accusations of domestic violence, and you could include for that, false accusations of non-payment of child support. And I think one of the things I would do is I would make sure that these infractions are adjudicated as crimes. Crimes that, like any other, many people are shocked when they find out that they're not adjudicated by crimes. When social workers have determined that you abuse your children, they don't arrest you and take you away in handcuffs and put you before a jury and give you a trial like in Perry Mason. They just take your children. They just take your children. When men are accused of domestic violence, they don't come in and necessarily, arrest you and take you to a courtroom and have you arraigned and read your rights and go on a trial before a jury. They just throw you out of your home and put you in a psychotherapy class. So this is wrong. American citizens who are accused of crimes need to be charged as criminals. And that has several benefits. First of all, if they're guilty, they can be punished. But if they're innocent, they can be left alone. They can be afforded the protections of due process of law, the rights like habeas corpus and double jeopardy and non-self-incrimination and things like that, and a jury trial. And if they are guilty, they can be duly punished. And if they're innocent, they can be left in peace in their own home with their children without further interference by government officials. So that's one example of the kind of thing I would do, is make sure these things are adjudicated as crimes. Susan Orr, who was a head of the Children's Bureau under President Bush, advocated this herself. I don't know how far she got in getting it implemented, but she was on the right track. You'd have to work in cooperation with the Justice Department and with maybe with the Education Department as well on some of these things to make sure that people like, university students and military men who are accused of sexual infractions are also tried, duly tried as criminals with due process of law, afforded all the protections of the Constitution. So those are, a couple of the most immediate, as I say, no-brainer things that I would do immediately. And then start looking into things that you mentioned, like, perverse incentives and the crazy incentives that arise from federal payments, like the Mondale Act and the VAWA Act and the Violence Against Women Act, and as you say, the federal child support statutes.
Is none of this, I'm just curious from either one of you, is none of this resolvable through civil rights litigation? It would seem to me that the fact that we're robbed of due process in this, there should be some grounds to sue the government through this. Do you know if anybody's tried?
I'll leave that
I'm
one for you,
sure
Dr.
people have
Baskerville.
tried. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the details of that. First of all, I'm sure people have tried. I don't think these suits ever get anywhere. Um, I don't know civil rights law that well. I mean, I tend to be a little leery and skeptical of civil rights law. I would prefer to look at this in terms of, ordinary criminal law, with which I think most people are more familiar. Civil rights law is a big, nebulous, and innovative area of the law that's very difficult to understand. I think sometimes civil rights law is part of the problem more than part of the solution. But one of the things, and this is another thing that the federal government could do, not the HHS so much, but the federal courts. Why isn't the federal courts reviewing these cases for civil rights abuses and constitutional rights abuses? And the answer, very simple, is a bizarre, arbitrary measure that the courts invoke, sometimes known as the domestic relations exception. The domestic relations exception is not a constitutional provision. It's not a law. It's not a duly enacted statute. It's just an arbitrary, self imposed rule that says that federal courts will not review family law cases for constitutional rights violations. Well, there's absolutely no excuse for this. Well, who says they're not going to do this? And what right do they have not to do this? So that's another area where the federal government could actually do some good, is for the courts to review family law cases and family policy matters, to detect and to highlight and to curtail violations of constitutional rights. And then agencies like HHS and ACF could step in and use the federal funds as leverage, negative leverage, to force the state governments to adhere to court rulings that find them in violation of constitutional rights. So there's a lot there is some things the federal government could do that would be very positive. Because after all, we have to remember state governments don't have clean hands either. They're not completely free of violating the constitutional rights of American citizens either. In fact, in terms of the judiciary, I think state courts are more corrupt than the federal courts. The federal courts look the other way, but the state courts are the ones that are actually violating Americans' rights.
Just to jump into a little bit for OCSS and what changes I'd make there if I was commissioner. One thing that I keep looking at is the money and how the federal government basically pays the state agencies and child support programs there. And there's typically about three streams of income. One of them is just a flat payment that's about 2/3. So the 2/3 of the administrative expenses that are used to basically run the child support program at the state, 2/3 of that are just comped by the taxpayer right off top. It used to be, I believe, like 85%, then they brought it to 66%. And then the other one is the states, depending on their certain factors, get to keep a certain amount of the recouped welfare monies back for themselves. And that either gets recycled again or whatever. So that is typically, it could be up to half. They could have to pay 80% back to the federal government. A lot of poorer states have to pay more back. States that contribute more have a higher per capita income, like California, tend to keep half. That's the second stream. The third stream is the incentive payment, which I mentioned earlier, and that's based off of the performance measure. So if a state, establishes a certain amount of child support orders, they establish paternity for a certain amount of kids born out of wedlock, they collect a certain amount of child support, they collect back pay, and then the cost, to do that, if they keep that efficient, based off of those performance measures, they're able to get an incentive payment that totals about 10% or so of the total amount of child support, both welfare and non-welfare collected. So whatever that amount is, based off their performance measures, they're going to get an incentive payment that is a percent amount of that total amount of collected, which is why states are so incentivized to get people wrapped up into this program.
Are you referring to Title 4D money?
Well, yes. This is what gets expended for a Title 4D. This is how Title 4D gets its money from the federal government. And OCSS is in charge of auditing basically these states and looking at these performance measures and seeing how they implement the program. So they'll look at that, basically grade the states, the counties and the states on how they're doing, and they're going to say, okay, here's your payments for this federal fiscal year. So one thing that is, I as a caseworker, I just know that it's very hard to collect on welfare cases. So what the system was originally designed for, which is to recoup welfare monies expended by getting these child support payments from, the dad that's not in the household, and then paying back the sort of government, account there. That's very hard to, pick up a guy and shake him by the ankles, especially if his job is selling dope on the corner or whatever it happens to be. And the amount of money collected from non-welfare cases really dwarfs the amount of money that the cases collect back from actual welfare funds. And since these performance measures are really determined they don't differentiate between welfare and non-welfare. So the amount of money they collect looks a lot higher because they're basically intruding into families that have nothing to do with welfare, because typically men who are involved in those families have an above-the-table job. You can just send an income garnishment and get the money without ever having to talk to them on the phone, essentially. So it's a lot easier to collect money there. And for me, what I'd like to do is pretty much get rid of that incentive payment, because those incentive payments were originally created, to get the states to work these non-welfare cases, essentially. And what I'd want to do is say, okay, well, you're going to get your 2/3 reimbursement. We can also lower that too, by the way. That right there can be changed from less than 2/3 to some other amount. But if we got rid of the incentive payment, then that would force states to have to think, okay, so what are we going to do with the money that we are getting? We should probably focus more on welfare cases, because the money that we collect from non-welfare cases isn't really going to go to getting us more money. So that'll at least take away the incentive for states and state agencies to be so, I guess, harsh with trying to get as much money on the books as possible. And I would like them refocused on trying to recollect welfare monies. And then the thing that I know is going to happen is that they're going to perform poorly on recouping welfare monies, because they've never done a good job of doing that. And my sort of intuition is that the reason they started going after non-welfare families is because they needed a way to sort of cover up how badly they were doing at collecting money on these welfare cases, essentially. So then that would be shown and revealed, and they would have to rethink how they're doing this to make it worth them. So I kind of look at that as, here's a little way to push back or kind of incentivize states to think, okay, we're not getting as much from the welfare or from the federal government for this. What are we going to kind of do to change this system or make it work a little bit better for us? That'd be the first thing I do. OCSS also has its kind of tentacles and other things. They also provide funding for different research and grants. And sometimes that has to do with trying to help fathers get custody. I think they send about 10 million a year. I think this is across all the states, so it's not really much money in trying to help fathers get custody of their children. I would like to see more money put into programs like that might actually work to help get fathers custody and help them in those battles, so to speak, and maybe get more research on that side of it. So I would kind of focus on those two small things. And, I think if there are going to be any bigger, more sweeping changes, that would depend on RFK and what Trump would be willing to do there and want to do. But I think just even those changes right there, they would be a little bit painful at first, especially for individual child support agencies, because their budget would be cut significantly. But I think that would be the right thing to do. I call it a sort of policy of diminishment. First of all, it'll save the taxpayers money. It'll make Dodge happy, just right off rip there. And then if anything, you can make these child support agencies more focused on getting the welfare monies back, because that's really what they were created to do in the first place. They weren't supposed to be going after families that had nothing to do with welfare. So that would then, I think, have another effect of pushing other families to then say, okay, well, if we're going to do this, maybe I'm more incentivized to keep the family together, or they'll have to go to the private family law court and pay out of pocket that way to try to get child support to do stuff instead of just being able to walk into the federally funded child support agency, pay like $25 or whatever that small fee is for non-welfare cases, and then have us do everything, use the county attorneys, use the county caseworkers, use the county enforcement measures. I'd rather they have to go through the private family law courts and have them look at it and put the burden back on them. So that would at least represent to me this kind of pushback into the way it used to be, and a kind of pullback of the sort of government and out of the private family law sphere, and kind of make the public family law machinery smaller, which is what I'd like to see ultimately happen.
Can I just add to that, Shah, the things that you've been talking about in the last few minutes are very important. And to understand the full horror of what you're explaining here is more than I think we can do today here in the time we have. But you've explained this in previous videos, some that you did yourself, some that you did with me. And I would urge readers, listeners to go and listen to those videos. I've also explained it in my books. But if anybody doesn't believe in a personal devil, the child support system, once you understand it in its full horror, will make you a believer. You can only believe that a little, red creature with horns and a cloven hoof could be sitting there with a T-square, devising, let me come up with the most evil government program I can, the one that destroys everything that we're trying to preserve in the United States, in the Western world. And the child support system is just, it is the work of an evil. It can only be seen as the work of an evil genius. It is just it is diabolical. It's just amazing. The incentive. I mean, basically, what you're doing, to put it in as succinctly as I can. And again, maybe we could do another show on that alone, or some of your previous videos. Basically, it's a system that allows state governments to fill their coffers by creating single mother homes, as many single parent homes as possible. And the key, I won't go into this, but the key office here is the state attorney general. His role is the role, usually it's a he, and although it was people like Kamala Harris, and as different as Kamala Harris and Josh Hawley have been state attorneys general, it is their job to maximize revenue from child support collections. And the only way to do that is to create as many single parent homes as possible. This is difficult to wrap your mind around, but when someone like Senator Josh Hawley writes a book about men and masculinity and the importance of families, and when he turns around and scolds men for not marrying, a cynic would be, and starting families, a cynic would be forgiven for thinking that the real reason that he wants men to marry and start families is so that they could then be forcibly divorced, and he could squeeze them for child support to fill up the coffers of the state of Missouri. I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah, I would.
You could not come up with a more. Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just gonna say, yeah, it's. I think someone that maybe doesn't have enough of a background or understand this, which, let's be frank, is most people, because not everybody understands the family codes and how they're applied. This is like there are so many layers to this, it's crazy. And it took me years at child support to start piecing this stuff together. But what you're saying is not incorrect. And it sounds almost wild to say that the state wants to see more single family homes, but there are actual monetary incentives for that. I do want to, I know we've reached about an hour and 15 minutes. One thing I did want to get in here before we put a close on everything is that, if we need folks to contact the White House, basically, and maybe, send them this video, talk about Dr. Baskerville, send them my channel. This is Shah. But you can call the White House at 202-456-1111, or you can go to their website and fill out the contact letter. You can even send them a letter the good old-fashioned way, and we'll put that stuff in the description of this video for you guys to be able to do that. And, if we can get folks lobbying on our behalf in that way, and at least maybe get some of this stuff in front of them, there might be a chance to see some of this stuff put into action. So I just wanted to say that, but Dr. Baskerville, if you got more, please chime in.
No, thank you. Anyone who's worked in a congressional office or the White House knows that these they do pay attention to the letters and correspondence they receive on every all issues. I mean, they tabulate, what people feel about views, and it's very important to them. So it seems old-fashioned to, send a letter to your senator or to the White House. It does make a difference, and it's actually makes more of a difference than just, watching videos and clicking like. Important as that can be, I'm not against that. But my point is that, translating that into concrete action, it really does make a difference.
Perfect. Well, Paul, if you got,
And by the way, I might add, I just want one point. You
sure.
can be sure the feminists are doing this. So
Yes. Yeah, it really is an indictment,
Yes,
even
it
on
is.
men collectively, that women will work so hard on getting this stuff done. I mean, I know men tend to be busy trying to figure things out, and men are expected to do a lot in our society, but we need to take a little bit of time to try to collectively organize in whatever ways we can to at least put some pushback, and this is one of the ways to do it. Paul, I want to
Is
hand it over to you.
Okay, I just wanted to add on to that as much as I totally agree with what you just said, Shah.
Mhm.
I think part of the explanation for that is that what Dr. Baskerville just pointed out, you look at Kamala Harris and Josh Hawley, and in this area, they're identical
Mhm.
ideologically, for all practical purposes. This is why I think a lot of men see no point in this.
Yeah.
But I think there is a point in it. And I'm, as a believer in the 6 degrees of separation, if you know somebody who knows somebody who knows RFK, get them this video and push for it. And definitely forward it to your local and federal political leaders. Uh, the feminists are brilliant at doing this, at organizing, at women circling the wagons together. They want to call it feminists circling the wagons. It's women. And they do a great job at it. And it's an area where we lag behind
Mm.
woefully so. Folks,
And
go
real
ahead.
quick, just one more thing. And I know, Paul, you know about a lot of this stuff, and same thing with Peter Wright. Is that there's definitely been a lot of men's rights activists and collectives of men who've tried to come together and actually do stuff and protest and send letters to their congressmen. There's so much of that stuff out there. I'd like to hope, just to leave it on a positive note, that maybe we're hitting a kind of cultural point or change where possibly doing some of that stuff now could kind of tip us over into a positive direction. So,
Certainly, I think the culture is moving in the right direction. How fast and for how long is another question, but
mhm.
right now the culture, I think, is moving in the correct direction for this because we're seeing the consequences of all these failed policies play out in catastrophic ways. And so with that, folks, I've been talking with Dr. Stephen Baskerville and from to Shah from This Is Shah channel on federal involvement and state involvement in our family lives and in the breakup of our families. It's been an interesting and great discussion. Let's follow it up and do it again sometime. Thank you both for
Thank
joining me
you.
here.
Thanks for having us.
thank you, Paul. Indeed.
Take care, folks. Bye bye.